Hello and welcome to the Farming Today podcast with me, Charlotte Smith. On this episode, more warnings of drought in England despite the rain.
While a few weeks of wet and changeable weather are very helpful, there is clearly a long way to go to recover. That's why we're calling for farmers to prepare for a potentially dry winter and what that might mean for next year.
Let's start, though, with the increase in fresh produce coming into the UK from West Africa. Over the winter, most of the sweetcorn, radishes, spring onions and chilli peppers sold by supermarkets will come from two farms in northern Senegal. The businesses involved say it's a win-win arrangement for the local communities, and more vegetables for the UK market are likely to be grown there in the future. For today's food programme, Dan Saladino and reporter Jack Thompson have been investigating the supply chain. They visited a farm run by SCL, joint partners with the UK veg company Barfoot's, where they met SCL's founder, Michael Laurent, and some of the workers.
Right now, I'm in the middle of a field of baby corn, and it's high above me. It goes over my head as far as the eye can see. That is going to arrive in the UK in 12 days.
In the UK, 2/3 of the cost of producing a pack of corn on the cob or a bunch of spring onions is labour. In Senegal, it's less than 1/3. And pay came up in a conversation Jack had with one of the pickers at SCL.
Mikel is standing with us, and she said if he could increase their salaries because times are difficult and Senegal is expensive. I appreciate the bravery to say that in front of the boss.
It was quite an audacious but deft interaction. She went from profuse thanks for the opportunity and then shifted to asking for a raise because her family needed more to get by. And this reflected many conversations we had in communities around pay. But what this picker didn't know, and this is what Mikel followed with in English, that she's about to receive a raise due to a government increase in the national minimum wage of 30%. And that means her monthly salary would go from £60 to £82.69.
I think it's a fair payment. Of course, it doesn't look a lot, but this is what we can propose here, because we're in a risky business, because you may have a lot of problems like too hot, too cold, problem of logistics. But yes, at the end you finish with a margin which is not very exciting sometimes, and we have to remain competitive also. Huh?
Mikel Laurent there, and you can hear more on the food programme that's at 11 this morning here on Radio 4. All this week, we are looking at growing mushrooms, and as a glance at a supermarket shelf will reveal, there are a growing number of varieties on offer. A farming family in Leicestershire has become one of the country's leading growers of woodland mushrooms, producing 25 tonnes a week. The Livesys, who farm near Ashby-de-la-Zouch, have created artificial growing conditions to grow 8 species of wild mushrooms, as Bob Huckenhull reports.
Well, I've come into one of the growing sheds now where there are rows and rows of vertical compost blocks containing oyster mushrooms, which are just starting to peep out. It's pretty warm in here to get the right conditions. With me is Tim Livesy.
Well, this is a miniature forest essentially, or woodland, and everything is, all the mushrooms will eventually grow off the vertical plane. We've got row after row of blocks of substrate. Imagine that's not blocks of substrate but are trees, and the growing environment in here is replicating what you would see on a late summer, early autumn, conditions in the woodland. The temperature is slightly reduced from the summertime. That's forcing the mushrooms or the mycelium to say, hey, it's time to reproduce. If the conditions are right for mushrooms, they'll double in size every 24 hours. That's pretty much across the board for most mushrooms, and it's our job to make sure they are the right conditions.
And we just heard that hissing noise. What's going on there?
Well, we're ventilating the growing room to keep the air nice and fresh, and as we do so the air tends to dry out, so we're reintroducing moisture through a humidification system.
On another part of the farm, they're mixing the substrate which the mushrooms are grown in. it can be a secretive side to the business, part of research and development to improve productivity.
Every different species we grow has a different nutritional requirement, and we grow it on different materials. And I say to people that what's in that substrate is our Coca-Cola recipe. We're always tweaking it and trying to improve yields and quality and shelf life and flavour. So here we've got yellow oyster mushrooms growing. These are found commonly growing in the Far East. They're not native to the UK or to Europe. They've got a brilliant bright colour, which unfortunately they lose when they're cooked, but they're very, very different flavour and texture to the grey oyster mushroom that we saw earlier on.
And what's your market? Who do you sell them to?
Now it's predominantly the retailers. If you came on this farm 15 years ago, it would have probably been 60% retailers, 40% food service. But after COVID, we sort of took the decision to pull out of the food service sector.
Tim says the mushroom growing industry has shrunk dramatically since he started 40 years ago due to cheaper imports and a lack of investment. But he's determined to carry on. All three of his children are involved, including son Will, who says it's a 24/7 job.
I went to bed at 9 o'clock last night. I set my alarm for 11:30 last night just to check my laptop to make sure a certain process was happening as it should. It wasn't, so I spent the middle of the night, 11:30 to 2:30, sat watching a computer at the farm, and when I was happy that the process was going according to plan, I went back to bed for 2 hours and then came back again. When it has to be done, it has to be done.
Will Livesley on the art of mushrooms. COP30, the annual world meeting on tackling climate change, is underway in Brazil. Now, this one is notable perhaps for the leaders who've skipped it. Neither the Chinese or American presidents are attending, but plenty of farmers are. The Brazilian hosts want agriculture to be seen as less of a climate problem and more of a solution. There'll be an Agriculture Day next week, and indeed our focus all next week will be on COP and climate change. BBC climate and science reporter Esme Stallard is at COP and sent us this report.
I'm in the Amazonian city of Belém in Brazil, where this year's annual UN climate summit COP30 is being held. The selection of the location was deliberate by the Brazilian hosts, who want to put forestry and agriculture at the heart of this year's COP. I spoke to Kaveh Zahidi, who is Director of Climate Change at the FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organization of the UN, and he said that agriculture has been missing from many of the conversations at COP in the last couple of decades, and then when it was discussed, it was done so negatively, talking about how the sector is responsible for a third of global emissions. But with Brazil being such a big exporter of crops and food products, they understand how much farming is impacted by climate change and how beneficial it can be to helping the world prepare for changing weather patterns. So what is Brazil actually doing here? Well, next week will be Agriculture Day, when we are expecting new funding announcements and many events being hosted for the 50,000 delegates here, which are made up of government officials, NGOs and academics. But we have already had some announcements. One of them is a project called RAISE, which aims to map the world's degraded land, of which there is 10 to 15% globally, so the funding can be better targeted to help regenerate it. Morgan Gillespie is Executive Director of the Food and Land Coalition and has been part of that development. She told me that the problem COPs have faced in getting progress on the issue is that there is not consensus on the best way to farm sustainably, unlike with energy where the best technologies are clear. She said a crucial part of that is twofold. The first is having farmers actually participate in the decision-making process. She said they understand the land best and also are the ones experiencing climate change firsthand. And walking around the halls here, you can definitely see that this year's COP has the highest participation of farmers. They are observers to the talks, which means they can sit in on them and watch how governments negotiate. But getting projects off the ground requires money as well, and COP is a key space for governments to negotiate money from each other and also funders. We will see over the coming weeks whether Brazil achieves its goal of this being a farming and implementation COP.
Esme Stallard there. There's more from COP on the first of the new series of Rare Earth at midday here on Radio 4. And talking of a changing climate, warnings that unless we see some serious rain, England will be in drought next year. The Environment Agency says there will be widespread impacts on farming as well as nature and describes the current situation as precarious. We've talked a lot on this programme about the hot, dry spring and summer. Well, the Environment Agency says England has had less than average rainfall for 8 out of 10 months so far this year. While the Met Office is expecting a lot of rain today because of Storm Claudia, it predicts a higher than usual likelihood of dry conditions between now and January. Andy Turner, Water Resources Manager for the Environment Agency, told me that farmers have to make business decisions about their water use and water storage.
Much of the East and West Midlands and Yorkshire, as well as parts of Sussex, are still suffering from drought. And there have been the early steps of recovery in the northwest, but ongoing pressures from the prolonged period of dry weather, they remain in East Anglia. A lot of the abstraction licences that authorise the taking of water out of the environment to fill reservoirs, they will enable farmers to take water now. And that's why it's really important that farmers take every opportunity to fill reservoirs when water is available. And, there's some very wet weather on the way over the next few days, for example. So we want them to look at taking that as an opportunity and throughout the winter period.
Because it could be by the time we get into even early spring, those abstraction licences which allow farmers to take water from rivers will be limited.
There is the real prospect of reduced access to water and some restrictions being in place next summer. So we want farmers to consider their water requirements for next year now and to look at the business risks of not having that water. They shouldn't just hope for rain.
There has been some frustration that farmers have expressed with the Environment Agency and some of the rules, particularly in places like the Fens, where they feel that rivers which are just running out to sea in a very few miles, they should be allowed to take more water out to try and irrigate water-hungry crops.
We've got a programme of work funded by DEFRA, which enables us to work with those groups of farmers to help them explore the options to improve water supply resilience, whether it's more farm storage reservoirs, whether it's making use of drainage water, or whether it's sharing water rights. Those studies in that programme of work, the local resource option studies, they give us the opportunity to work with farmers to help identify, screen and rank the options available to farmers to help improve water security going forwards.
At what point will you be advising farmers actually to think differently about the sort of crops they grow, if this is going to be the trend for the future?
What we want is for farmers to work as businesses to make sure that they are aware of the risks from a changing climate. It's for businesses to look at the individual risks of not having water and for us to help communicate that, but also to work with farmers to help them understand their options. We are working very closely with the National Farmers Union and others who represent the sector to set up water abstractor groups, which are usually groups of farmers and growers who are geographically located together. And in the short term, they might provide opportunities to share water rights or to trade them with each other. But in the longer term, there may be opportunities to co-develop infrastructure, such as shared farm storage. So we want to work very, very closely with the sector to give the sector the absolute maximum chance of improving water supply resilience to be able to cope with that changing climate.
Andy Turner from the Environment Agency. That's it from us. I'm Charlotte Smith. The producer is Beatrice Fenton, and Farming Today is a BBC Audio Bristol production.